Today's meeting is about an issue which I think is absolutely central. I think it's central to workers across the world, but I'm going to argue particularly in Britain, because if you want to talk about a strategy of resistance to austerity and about possibilities for social change, and in particular if you want to talk about the possibility of creating socialism, you can't talk about it without talking about the mass organisations of the working class, which remain the trade unions. And that would always be true, but we are living through a period of fundamental counter-reform, where the ruling class are trying to shift backwards living standards on a scale that's not been seen probably for 2 generations. And I use the example of Cyprus. So when they went to bail the banks out in Cyprus, they said that in order to pay for it, they would go to bank accounts, and anyone who had 85,000 euros or less, they would take 7% of their savings. 7% of their 85,000. And not only the people of Cyprus are up in arms about it, even the Daily Mail and the Express. This is terrible. How can you go to people's bank accounts and take away from them their life savings? And yet in Britain, as a public sector worker, they've taken 18% of my real pay. And because my pension is linked to my pay, they've taken 18% of my pension. And we're only not even halfway through. And that's true not just in terms of pay, and it is a fundamental fact that for the first time since 1945, wages for employed workers have gone down. You know, Thatcher just died, I'm sure we're all very delighted, but under Thatcher, all the terrible things, wages for employed workers increased during Thatcher's time. Not all over the world, by the way. In America, they cut real wages during that time. And there's a lot of reasons for that, principally in my mind, the magnificent struggle that the miners put up, which, although they lost, it held back the ruling class. But it is an absolutely fundamental shift. And it's not just in terms of wages, in terms of what people might call the social wage, the things we've all grown up with, the post-war settlement, the welfare state, our NHS, free education for all the things that people grew up with, all of those things are now back. And if you look at the benefit changes in particular, where they want to put back into working class people fear, real fear of unemployment. In the Tories' minds, there's always been, Marx wrote when he wrote Capital about the reserve army of labour and how useful that was for capital in terms of holding back workers' struggle and holding down pay. But they want people again to fear. I mean, people have heard Marion Nesbitt speak at the opening rally in this conference, but she expresses absolutely brilliantly both the fear and terror they're trying to put in people and the depth of the anger that's bringing forward. So that's a background to the period. And that's why when we talk, and when there is a talk about a general strike, and it makes sense for people, it's because people want to see resistance to all of those things right across the working class movement. And I was, on the benefits, I was very, very pleased indeed that at Unison Conference a resolution was agreed which said that we're campaigning for a UK-wide no eviction policy, but we need to turn that into reality. I think workers everywhere need to be opposing the threat of evictions of people, whether they work directly or in terms of supporting people when they're hated. So in face of all that, in face of all that's against us, the question that workers ask themselves right across Britain is, why not a higher level of resistance? Why aren't our trade unions doing more? Why aren't they fighting harder? And one argument that's coming up, and I think it's been around this Marxism, is not really about the trade unions or the trade union leaders, but about the working class itself. Whether the working class, in some cases, whether it's dead, whether it still exists, whether it's changed in such a way that it's no longer capable of waving struggle, whether we need to look to new layers in society that are actually the radical elements. And I'm just going to touch very briefly on this. I've heard the word knocked around about the precariat, and people have probably heard this. So I read a book about the precariat, and it's very interesting. And broadly it's saying old class structures no longer exist, but instead there are now 7 groups in society, it argues. It argues at the top is an elite, consisting of a tiny number of absurdly rich global citizens lording it over the universe with their billions of dollars, listed in Forbes as amongst the great and the good, able to influence governments everywhere and to indulge in munificent philanthropic gestures. So there you are, a very tiny crust. Then just below them, just below that elite, comes the salariat, still in stable full-time employment. Some hoping to move into the elite. I can see a lot of people here thinking they're getting the full rich list. The majority just enjoying the trappings of their kind, with their pensions, paid holidays, and enterprise benefits, often subsidised by the state. The salariat is concentrated in large corporations, government agencies and public administration, including the civil service. Now that's quite amazing. I won't go through all the other 7 gradations, but I'll just give you an idea. Below them comes what they call a shrinking core of manual employees. And here's the interesting bit, I suppose. Underneath those 4 groups, there is a growing precariat flanked by an army of unemployed, and this is what it says in here. I mean, people will probably find it offensive, I do. A detached group of socially ill misfits living off the dregs of society. Now that's the definition. Now that doesn't sound reactionary enough. People should know what kind of conclusions it leads to, because this argument, I mean, it's rather like the arguments around the EDL, that it's a disenfranchised white working class. And it talks about in Prato, so sitting near Florence in Italy, where there were riots against Chinese workers. And just to give you a flavour of where it can lead you to, this is what it says about these riots against Chinese workers. The problems were not just caused by intolerant locals, the nature of the enclave contributed. While Prato's old factories struggled to compete, leaving Italian workers to seek alternative sources of income, the Chinese built up a community within a community. Chinese gangs reportedly organised the exodus from China and ran the enclave, albeit vying for control with gangs from Russia, Albania, Nigeria and Romania, as well as with the mafia. And they were not just restricting themselves to Prato. Chinese gangs were linking up with Chinese companies and investing in Italian infrastructural projects, including a proposed multi-billion euro China terminal near the point of Civitavecchia. Now, that's where those kind of arguments lead to, and people should realise when they have this argument, because in this salariat, I ask myself, who are you talking about with their pensions and their stable jobs? I mean, are you talking about, I see Brian at the back here, are you talking about the people on strike in one housing group, trying to stop their pay being cut? Are you talking about the future direction workers fighting against the impacts of privatisation? Are you talking about the 220,000 teaching assistants that Gove wants to get rid of? Are you talking about the mid-Yorkshire health workers fighting about downgrading in pay? I guess I say some people are talking about the teachers. Honestly, does anyone really think teachers with their pensions, that these are, and now I see a few teachers sitting here, and I know they're all hoping to be in the Forbes rich list next year. Once they get their performance-related pay, they'll be going here. But this is absurd, and it's absurd because actually, in my opinion, the opposite is the case. I mean, because people have been talking about the Irish tradition, I actually bothered to read back on Duncan Hallis in 1974 about white-collar workers, about the proletarianisation of white-collar workers that people have talked about for 45 years. And the truth is that is stronger now than ever. You know, you look at not just what people do. If you look at the average white-collar, if you're a teacher, the methods that were used to increase production in factories are now applied to you right across the board. Performance management, everything you do, you have no control over everything. People feel more like workers now than they ever have before. I will throw this in because it actually reminds me of the right-wingers, and I will throw this in because I like her very dearly. I don't know if anyone heard of a woman called Ruth Lee. She's an attack dog for the ruling class. Institute of Directors, she used to be the chief UK economist for Lehman Brothers. I was on strike in 2006 about my gold-plated pension. And while I was on strike, there was a rally at Westminster Central Hall, and I needed a bit of air, so I came outside. I couldn't believe it. There was Ruth Lee, talking live to the BBC about the gold-plated public sector pension. So I know it's rude, but I bumped in. I butted in. And I said, Ruth, do you know how much our gold-plated pension is on average? £3,800. She carried on talking. I said, £3,800, how gold? And then I said to her, look, we're on telly here, Lee. I know, you're a lawyer, I'll make a contract with you right here and now in front of all these people. And the contract I'll make is this. I've been working a long time, I've got a long time in the pension scheme, but I'm generous. I will give you my gold-plated pension in exchange for yours. Strangely enough, she didn't take me up on it. But these are repeating the worst arguments of the ruling class. And the truth is, if you look around Europe, if you look at resistance to austerity, organised workers are at the heart of it. You know, look at Greece, the public sector strikes, absolutely at the heart of it. So class is right back on the agenda. And I would argue the sense of class is better. I mean, I think Cameron must bitterly regret ever using that stupid expression, we're all in it together. Because what it made clear to people, we're not in it together with you, but most of us are in it together because we do share a common class and a common class interest. So the question people ask themselves is, so why isn't there more of a fight? And here I think we have to argue that where a lead has been given, workers have shown they are willing to resist. I mean, at the highest level so far on the 30th of November, the truth is millions of workers did come out on strike when they were given a lead. Across the country, you look at places where there is leadership, people are willing to fight. The question is, why won't the trade unions fight, or why won't they fight consistently? And I want to try and deal with a few of the arguments that come up. Probably one of the most popular arguments at the moment is the argument about it's about left and right-wing union leaders, good and bad union leaders. And most commonly, normally the worst baddie is Dave Prentice. Now, me and Dave are not very close, I have to be honest. But it's the argument that somehow what's wrong at the top of unions is the left versus the right. Now, it's true there are many differences between trade union leaders, and if you're honest, many people in my union say to me that they would love to have Mark Savotka as our General Secretary. And in truth, so would I. If I had a choice between Mark Savotka and Dave Prentice, I'd choose Mark every time. But then you look and ask yourself, there's a problem. Because if you look at what happened after the 30th of November, it is not true that it was only Dave Prentice who retreated. It's true that Dave Prentice was the first to go for the retreat, but the relationship between the union leaders meant one after one, they all went into separate negotiations with the government and they all suspended industrial action. So it's not true that it's simply the left versus the right. I would argue there's a much more fundamental distinction, and that is a distinction between the interests of the trade union bureaucracy as a social layer and of ordinary workers. And many years ago, Sidney and Beatrice Webb started to analyse it, and they started near the end of the 19th century, when in the whole of Great Britain, I think there were only about 600 or 700 union officials, which, when you think, I think in Unison alone, we must have the best part of 2,000 full-time officials. So that's, even then, they identified the development of what they called, and they thought it was a good thing, a professional class of negotiators who were more responsible, who had risen out of the rank and file and spent their time negotiating professionally on their behalf. Now they identified that when that was a very small development. We now have a very strongly developed bureaucracy indeed. And the truth is they don't enjoy the same pressures as ordinary workers. Finalisers don't work. They don't face the same pressures as us. When our pensions are changed, they're on. If we don't get a pay increase, they still do. They tend to earn far more than ordinary workers. But more importantly, they see the role of the union itself as becoming more important than the struggles that workers want to be in the union for. The union machinery itself becomes more important. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, she talks about trade unions, she described it as the labour of Sibyllus, rolling the stone up to the top of the hill and back down again. And while she was talking about the fact that trade unions negotiate within capitalism terms of exploitation, but don't challenge exploitation itself. And therefore, someone comes to be the arbiter, the negotiator in between. And that puts enormous pressure in terms of their social existence, but also because they put the machinery itself, you know, the means becomes more important than the ends, they dislike risk. And so typically, it's one of the reasons why the Tory anti-union laws have been so effective. Because unlike in the early 70s, when they hit directly at shop stewards, and so at Pentonville, when stewards were faced with the anti-union laws, they still took action, and people took strike action to defend them and get them out of Pentonville prison. The anti-union laws today hit at the potential of taking away the funds and the assets of the union. So they hit at the conservatism and the worry of the trade union leaders about their leaders. So that's an argument about in terms of the argument and the left to be right. Now, I also want to argue that it's not as simple as that, because trade union leaders are not bosses. They are not part of the ruling class. And they are subject to lots of different pressures. They are subject to pressure from the ruling class. And partly, for trade union leaders to represent anything, they have to have a level of clout against the ruling class. If you can deliver nothing at all for workers, why are you even going to have a trade union at all? It's why you find sometimes even very right-wing union leaders can become quite radical. Most famously, people talk about organising new workers and new unions, and one of the big examples in history was in America in the 1930s. And the Congress of Industrial Unions, the CIO, was started by John L. Lewis, who was a rabid anti-communist leader of the mine workers union. But when they shrunk to 100,000, he recognised that the only way the union could survive was by taking on militant tactics of organising. And so trade unions are subject to pressure from there, and they're subject to pressure from below. And so they vacillate. Sometimes they move one way, sometimes they move another. And you can see that if you look at the history of the last couple of years. Because if you look even into 30th November, so in my opinion, the 30th November wouldn't have happened without Dave Prentice. Had he not moved to go for strike action, and in doing it, he moved against a whole series of his own full-time officials, who were at the very top of the union, who actually were against striking at all on the 30th November, but Prentice recognised the need that he had to be seen to be fighting in some way. But equally, Prentice wanted to turn the tap off almost as soon as it happened. And therefore you see union leaders, they can be pushed one way or the other. They're not entirely consistent. Against that, there is the other tradition, and that's the tradition of organising in the rank and file. And that's saying that there is a possibility of independent organisation from below. At the highest point that people refer back to in Britain, the shop stewards movement and the Clyde workers movement in the First World War, having shop stewards who are capable of leading significant groups of workers independently within the official structures within the official structures of the unions, but outside them if necessary. And probably a quote that people who've been to meetings like this will be familiar with from the Clyde Workers Committee in 1915, if I just find it here. And that summed up really the approach of the independent shop stewards movement. And this is the quote: it said, "We will support the officials just so long as they rightly represent the workers, but we will act independently immediately they misrepresent them. Being composed of delegates from every shop and untrammelled by obsolete rule or law, we claim to represent the true feeling of the workers. We can act immediately according to the merits of the case and desire the rank and file." In other words, their independent shop steward organisation based on strong militant shop floor organisation says if the officials don't act with us, we'll act against them. And that principle really is the principle that in the Socialist Workers' Party we have always tried to apply to trade unions. But you have to recognise you can't just suck that out of your thumb. You know, you can't just suck a rank and file movement. It's not wish fulfilment. Just saying I like a rank and file movement doesn't create one, because it comes out of the real confidence and real struggles of the working class. And therefore, socialists have to have a nuanced attitude about understanding the bureaucracy and the rank and file. I'm going to try and sum it up in the way Trotsky did. Trotsky said, with the bosses, never. With the bureaucrats, sometimes. With the workers, always. And I think he summed up in that a method of operation about understanding how sometimes you work with people, but you can be with people and against them, sometimes at the same time. So if union leaders move in the right direction, we want to move with them. But also we want to guard people about the need for independent organisation and the need to be able, if necessary, to take things further. And that's why you can see, I mean, perversely, you can see in history, even very right-wing union leaders who are capable of presiding over very high levels of struggle. Now, if people look back to the 70s, people think of the miners' strikes in 72 and 74, but the national leadership of the miners was Joe Gormley, very extreme right-wing leader. Underneath him, you had, at that time, Arthur Scarborough, Barnsley Miners Forum, very, very strong rank and file organisation capable independently of picketing and of taking the struggle forward. And therefore, we need to understand the difference that both sides of the equation are working with and against. And I just want to spell out a bit more on the left versus right, because in a certain sort of way, I know people might think this is a bit controversial, in a certain sort of way, we don't really have many old-style right-wing trade union leaders at the moment in Britain. You know, when I was a young trade unionist in the civil service, the right wing was a woman called Kate Lazinska. And she wasn't just against strikes, She was in a Catholic international organisation linked, and it is, you may think I'm paranoid, linked to the CIA. Seriously. And our union, one year it used to be led by the Socialist Party, down a minute, the next year led by the CIA. That's how it went. So, to be honest, when people talk about right-wingers, I have a slightly different idea. Dave Prentice doesn't quite fit into the Kate Winslet category. And in truth, if you went round all the union conferences this year, if you went to all the big unions, most people in this room, if you look at what was discussed, I suspect 99% of what was voted on, you'd all agree with. It's against austerity, it's internationalist, it's anti-racist, it's against all forms of discrimination. Formally speaking, that's the so in a sense, now I want to go through what I think therefore the problems, because that leads people to two things. When you say with and against, I think some people fall into the trap of thinking, if a union leader sounds all right, you have to be with them uncritically, 100%. That really, I mean, I suppose can be the most extreme with Mark, because Mark is the best. Mark's a vodka that you can't possibly have criticism. But I would go back to the debate about Jonh McLoughlin, because I think we could have made a terrible mistake had we not supported Jerry Hicks. The idea that Jonh McLoughlin was so super popular and had great support among the rank and file, and that if we stood against him, or if we supported Hicks, we'd drive him to the right, and socialists would be marginalised, and it would be terrible, and Unite would turn into somewhere that socialists could never operate in again. And had we gone along with that, I think that would have been an absolute bloody disaster. Jerry Hicks' vote, what did it tell us? It told us the deep level of discontent about the failure to provide effective leadership to everyone. I mean, someone said to me in a meeting that it's interesting actually, because people say Unite's cuddly. Don't witch hunt, it's very interesting. Immediately someone stands against them, the SWP. I was told it was going to be a referendum on the SWP in the National Union. Well, if it was a referendum, we did quite well. But the idea, the common feature the bureaucracy come out. The other side of it is where people say the bureaucracy is so right-wing that you can never do anything. And actually we get this quite a lot in unison. People say, we'd like to fight, but there's no point trying to get a ballot because we know we'll turn it down and you'll never get anywhere. And this, in my opinion, leads to the worst kind of passivity. The worst kind of passivity. And I'll give you a little example from my own experience, because back in 2010, start of 2011, we agreed we were going to go for a coordinated strike. We said, we know there's huge cuts coming, we're going to try and get coordinated action in our council, but we're going to talk to other councils around London. Can we get the council unions, the teaching unions, can we get a broad strike together? Because we need to fight where we are, but we need something bigger, we need a movement. And the teachers union, they got the strike ballot quite easily. My equivalent, Alex Kenny, he's on the national executive of the NUT and he's very close to their leadership, so he gets a ballot just like that. In Unison, it was a bit harder. And I'll see Jim Board sitting here, and if you're in Unison, you'll know the nightmare. Are your records up to date? And you get told, and you get a list of literally hundreds of people, you haven't got the right address. Now there's two ways you could react to that. You could say, you bastards, you frustrated us again, I am going to denounce you, you're terrible, you have stopped us fighting. I'll tell you what I did. I spent all night in our branch office. I don't know why I did it. I went home for 1 hour. I still wonder why I bothered going home for 1 hour. For 36 hours, we worked non-stop, and we got the records up to date, and we got the ballot, and more importantly, we got the strike. Because the fact of the strike is far more important than denouncing the right-wing leadership that wants to stop you having a ballot. And see, I want to say this because I'm not Michael Gove, but I'm developing a bit of a thing about grammar. And my thing about grammar is this: I don't like. Are there any English teachers here? So I'm going to probably get this wrong. I don't like the subjunctive and the conditional tense. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I don't like people who say, we should have done this, or we could have done that, or we would do this. I like people who say, this is what we've done, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going to do. Because for revolutionaries, the deed comes first. You have to act. You have to be a fighter, not a commentator. We're not about sitting around reading books, commentating and saying what other people should have done. If you're not fighting, you're not even starting to talk about being a revolutionary socialist. I just want to do a couple of things. I want to run through, I want to talk a little bit about United Resistance if I can. Because people talk about then, what's the purpose of having people in positions in the union? If you think, now, why do socialists stand for any positions? And I want to just explain it a little bit by running through a few things in the last couple of years. Because I've said for my position, if I weren't the branch secretary, we would have had that strike, in my opinion. I might be wrong, but that's my view of it. People say we've got a lot of members on the executive of the UCU, and we have. And I say the test is, what do they do and what have they done? So when I look and I see that in the UCU, back in March 2011, they were the first union to take strike action on pensions and start to build a movement that would unite unions together. I say that's a fantastic job of work by our comrades. That's what revolutionary should be. When they moved forward to the 30th of June with joint strike act with chiefs and civil servants, it was moving the movement forward. When that moved forward to the 30th of November and millions of people on strike, it moves the movement forward. And that, I think, has to be our attitude. That socialists have to be judged not on positions for their own sake, not on passing left-wing resolutions, but how do you take the class struggle forward? How do you enable rank and file workers, give them the confidence to take action? I haven't got very long, so I'm just going to try and finish on a couple of things, because people say then, I'm going to say a couple of basics. If people ask me, what if I'm a new worker and I go to work, what should I do? Well, first thing is you should join a trade union. And to be honest, I was in the Labour Party a long, long time ago. But even when I was in the Labour Party, it was a condition of membership that you had to sign up to a trade. And I don't understand revolutionary socialists who ask this question. Should I join a trade union? To me, secondly, you have to relate politically to people. But the last bit I want to talk about is a little bit of our model of what a trade unionist is. I'm not going to go a long way about the quote from Lenin about being a tribune of the oppressed. But I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience, because we are not just about bread and butter. We're not just about how much your wages are, or whether you save your job, or whether you service. We are about fighting for the unity of the working class. So I'm going to talk about two things. Where are we now? July. In October this year, 20 years ago, it's a very memorable year. I don't know if people remembered it, the hot summer of 20 years ago. Stephen Lawrence got murdered in April. Week after he got murdered, the BNP marched past the spot where he was murdered. In October, in my borough, on the Isle of Dogs, Derek Beacon got elected as a BNP councillor. And that was shocking. But the thing I was really proud about is what happened the next day. Because before he could walk into the council chamber, in our branch, people walked out on strike and said, we're not going to have a BNP councillor. And that's a tradition that runs through, not just, in my opinion, in our area of East London, but through what we've done. Now, one of the reasons the EDL, in my opinion, will never step foot into our hamlets is because between the unions and the community and UAF, we have got solidarity and strength that says we will not allow fascists in. The last thing I just want to finish on is about our vision of the working class, just not locally but internationally as well. See, I don't know if people saw, they must have seen, in April this year, the absolutely horrific events at Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, where over 1,100 women, mainly women workers, under a factory that collapsed. A factory that's built in a swamp, an 8-storey factory built in a swamp with thousands of workers with vibrating machinery. That's not an accident. That was something bound to happen about the drive for profit. And like everyone, I'm sure here, people were shocked and angered by it. And I'll say two things about the reaction. The first, I do think this is important, that the first reaction came in Bangladesh itself. The reason I say that is too often people talk about workers as victims, and particularly if they're in the third world. And particularly if you look at 19-year-old women working in a garment factory. Did people see Reshma Begum, who miraculously survived for 17 days, buried under? Reshma Begum's 19 years old. Do you know how many days she'd worked in the factory? 20. She worked in the factory for 20 days, spent 17 days buried underneath it. But their reaction was they struck and they marched, because they're not just victims, they're the agents of change. No less than the match girls were. This is not some romantic history, this is the here and now. They are agents of change. And in our branch, we have very close connections with Bangladesh, so we agreed to do a collection, and we collected £3,000. That's probably better for us than it was for them, because people felt positive solidarity doing something. And so we linked up, and we had, because you do these things nowadays, I'm crap with technology, but we did a Skype link. And the thing that really struck me was that when we were talking to the workers in Bangladesh, this is what they said to us. they said to us, we also remember that on the 30th of November 2011, when you were striking for your public sector pensions in London, we organised a demonstration of garment workers in Dhaka in support of you. Now, the average wage of a garment worker is £250 a year. Don't matter how bad they get my pension, they're not getting it that low. But they didn't look at us as rivals or rich Western workers. They saw us as brothers and sisters of one working class facing the same problems, not in the same form throughout the world, but we stood together, and that's what we stand for. One working class that can transform the world, and I hope this weekend we're trying to form an instrument with which we can break the old system and create a new one.
I think there's no doubt, is there, that the problem with the trade union bureaucracy, its ability to hold back struggle, it's linked to labour, its willingness to, its main overriding principle being about negotiations within the framework of capitalism is one of the biggest obstacles that we have to get in revolutionary change and to get in workers to fight. It cuts against, doesn't it, the idea about the self-emancipation of workers, the idea that real change comes from below, it comes from ordinary people fighting for themselves and not looking to a bureaucracy to negotiate on their behalf and maybe get them a little bit of a better deal. I know Engels talked about strikes as being the military school of the working class, which is why they're so important, isn't it? It's where workers come into struggle, they start to learn, they start to challenge the bosses, start to see the world in different ways. So the trade union bureaucracy is something that is absolutely essential that we, especially as revolutionary socialists, try to grapple with, and the problem that we try to overcome. But you see, it's not just as simple, is it, as I think some people argue, really. It's not just as simple as maybe, okay, they're absolute sellout bastards, we've got what we've got to do, which they are, but we've got to set up perhaps our own unions that are better, that fight in a better way. And it's not just as simple as being able to just explain to people how terrible they are, be the people that speak the truth to workers, and hope that people one day finally realise. And the reason for that, isn't it, is because we want to relate to ordinary working class people, and they look to the trade union leaders as some kind of hope, some kind of way of, people believe they're going to make their lives a little bit better. And actually, when you look at history, lots of trade union struggles have made lives a little bit better. It's not true that they've always been completely shit. When unions fight, they win things. Sometimes you get a good negotiator actually goes in and they get you a good deal at work. They get you off getting sacked and all of this kind of thing. And because we want to relate to those people, and at the same time explain to them the problems of the bureaucracy, that leaves us in quite a difficult situation, doesn't it? It's a difficult thing to do, to both explain to people why the trade union bureaucracy can't deliver real change, why you've got to do it for yourself, at the same time as not isolating yourselves from those workers by simply denunciations and all the rest of it, which is why we talk about with and against. And I want to give a little bit of an example. I'm a teacher, so at NUT conference this year, we had a whole swathe of the union really angry that the strikes are not going forward in the way that they want. And there's two ways to fight that, one of which I think is the right way, which we did, which we did, and one of which is completely the wrong way. A wrong way would be to say it's all over, the trade union bureaucracy is absolute sellouts, this thing's all over, let's go home, and just hope that people one day realise how terrible they are. The other one is to look at the little examples where they are fighting and to throw our weight behind all the fights that are happening in order to build rank and file confidence, and then while we're doing that, to discuss the problems of the union bureaucracy as we go along and try to organise with a rank and file approach. But that has to be on the basis of getting people confident, really, and looking at confidence. And just finally, to weave that course between not accommodating to the trade union bureaucracy and also not being sectarian towards the trade union bureaucracy is difficult, and you can't do it without revolutionary organisation, which is why I think you should join the SWP.
Tell you a story about Guy's and Tommy's Hospital in South London. Group of shop stewards discovered that the pharmacy in the hospital was being outsourced to Sainsbury's. They organised a campaign against it. We don't want drugs for being looked at the same way as baked beans. It's not exactly the best thing to happen. Organised a campaign, did things like leaflet outside Sainsbury's supermarkets, leverage type campaigns, massive support for it from ordinary members of the public, and built up a real anger around it. The union bureaucracy opposed this campaign. Unite's got a policy against privatisation, but because Unite organises in Sainsbury's, the bureaucracy saw it as a campaign against another section of the union, didn't understand the dynamics of it. The comrades involved in the campaign were instructed to remove the Unite logos from their leaflets. They turned around to the bureaucracy in a number of quite angry meetings and said, roughly, piss off, it's our union, not yours. Carried on the campaign. Absolutely brilliant. Out of that, it's the largest Unite Health branch in the country. Out of that, they ran a campaign to take over the branch from the right-wing leadership and won it overwhelmingly. Sounds like a good story. Problem is, they've all now resigned from their positions in the union. All resigned. And the reason for their resignation, they said they weren't getting enough support from the full-time officers. This is the contradiction. People are angry, who know how to fight, can win a fight, but at the same time don't have the confidence on the long term to operate independently as a bureaucracy. That's a contradiction we face at the moment. These are not bad people, they're not people who don't have are simply not willing to involve members or anything like that at all. It's that contradiction that we have to address. Because actually what we're talking about, when we talk about rank and file and bureaucracy, what we're trying to build up is the confidence of the rank and file to operate independently as a bureaucracy. And one of the challenges we have, because it's so easy to get positions in unions these days, I always make a joke about Ian Allinson, Britain's biggest union, managed to get re-elected twice unopposed to the national executive. That's not, no criticism of Ian, but it's not exactly a tremendous mandate for a fighting union. But the problem is, it's so easy to be in the bureaucracy, and the comments which were made about how we can leverage the bureaucracy to be able to get fights going. The problem about that is it can lead to a situation where you forget about building up independence from the bureaucracy and building up that strength. Where are we campaigning other than the Unite for the election of full-time officials? Where are we campaigning? Where are we campaigning to really break with the bureaucracy? That's what we need to do if we're actually going to start building the sort of rank and file movement we need.
I just wanted to talk very briefly about the difference that revolutionaries, when they come into contact with rank and file in their own unions and in other unions, can make. And I'll talk very briefly about three disputes. The first is the Lindsey oil refinery dispute. People will remember this as a British jobs for British workers dispute that broke out unofficially around a Scunthorpe oil refinery. And we sent comrades over from Sheffield and from other districts to intervene in that dispute. And when we first arrived that first morning to picket line with about 300 or 400 construction workers, getting out of the car and looking at it and thinking, if we get this wrong, we're fucking dead. And walking up to that and starting a systematic argument with rank and file workers about the slogan British Jobs for British Workers, how wrong in terms of direction, in terms of politics that was, and systematically over about 2 or 3 weeks, first the placards started to disappear, then the Union Jacks started to disappear, and then the Union full-timers started to argue against that slogan. That was systematic intervention by revolutionaries and left-wingers into that dispute. More recently, last year we had 2 disputes in Doncaster where I work. The CETA bin workers, members of the Unite Union, were on strike over a pay increase and parity with workers in another area of their company. And when we arrived at that picket line, just 2 comrades from Doncaster, they were stood around on the pavements, and the company were bringing bin wagons in and out of that depot. They were allowing that to happen. The argument that we conducted was that they should blockade the depot. And when they did, and they stopped the first wagon, and they had a half-hour standoff, and then they had to reverse the wagon back into the depot, the confidence of those workers lifted massively. That escalated that dispute systematically and took it, for a very brief period of time, out of the hands of the full-time officials. But when we talk about with and against the union officials, they also recognise the importance of with and against. They recognise that when they want to mobilise people, they look to people like us in order to be able to motivate, to inspire and to set out a strategy to win. But they are also then very carefully looking at not allowing those disputes to get out of hand and trying to rein them back in, which is exactly what we saw in CETA and what we saw again with the Tesco distribution workers in Doncaster when they started to blockade a major Tesco distribution depot at one point with a picket line of 200 and a tank. I've no idea how that developed. We didn't argue for the tank, but the creativity of rank and file workers knows no bounds, I think. I'll leave it there, cheers.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on the point that Pete raised about how you get to a point of confidence of workers, and it's not some easy formula that we can talk. We can say this is the formula that people go out and do, and therefore if we get the right formula, we can talk about it. It's actually, coming back to what John said, it's actually what you do. And the example I want to use is a local one. Last year we had our traffic wardens. I work in Camden Council. Our traffic wardens wanted to have a fight over pay, but they had to be organised first. They had to be a recognised trade union, and we went through 2 years of actually building up towards that. At the point at which we put in a demand for a pay rise, we had 6 shop stewards in that section, and we had to go through all the process of actually fighting the bureaucracy about getting a strike. But it was about the leadership of the branch, and actually it's the points of actually people standing for positions as well as what you do with it. It's not good enough just to say you've got the right policies, it's actually what you go out and do about it. So we did eventually get, against all the odds and the highs and lows of actually being involved in organising a strike is absolutely impossible almost, but you have to get through that. And you can't put these barriers up to say the bureaucracy is putting up these barriers, therefore it's their fault, not what. We always find a way around it, and actually we've got to look and use our initiative and stuff in order to find those ways around it. And I think that what Pete talked about the leadership resigning from the union. I think that's actually it is a defeat, and I don't think Pete was saying it wasn't a defeat. How you get past that is actually really, really important. Now the thing that actually made the difference with the NSL strike last year, and which we've still got 8 shop stewards and they're organising still, is through the intervention of the branch. It was the picket lines that we had, where we had visits from other workplaces around the area. We wrote to all the NSL, the traffic wardens, organised workers in different parts of London, and got solidarity messages back. Interestingly, when they tried to get scabs from others to come and cover the work in Camden, because we'd done the work beforehand, actually we stopped that. And so now there's a strike that's coming up, Unite members in Ealing in London, where the NSL, because there's another pay strike over there, which I do think had an influence from what we did in Camden, they're now looking for scabs from Camden to go over there. The first thing we do is actually say we're not going to have scabs, and to a person, nobody's going to be going over and covering that. So those are little things, but actually really important about the groundwork you do in order that you can then face those arguments about how you organise. So the confidence comes from what you do, not what you say necessarily.
I see the problem with the Clyde slogan is this. There's a word called independence. To act independent of the bureaucracy. And when our class is not in a position to act independently because of the impacts and the confidence and the organisation of that class, then we have a difficulty with that slogan, because it stands, and I marched behind on the May Day with exactly that slogan for the Midlothian Trades Council, who had that slogan, but nobody on that march could actually seriously act independently in their circumstances because of the situation in our class. That doesn't mean to say there is not examples that we can use. Therefore, my involvement in the blacklist, my involvement in the construction workers dispute, right, is an example. But I'll tell you what happens in the rank and file in the construction in Unite. McCluskey comes along and sends a couple of officials, and they start saying to the guys, oh, by the way, what you can do is let's call a demonstration and we'll give you your train fare. We'll put you up in a hotel. We'll give you money every day, right? And then you find some conflict when you go to the construction meeting and you start to argue that McCluskey will do this, this and this. Oh no, they're fully behind us, Willie. You're mad, right? This is the conflict in between. I remember somebody once told a joke, and it says this. A woman trade union official stands in front of a mass meeting and said, look, I've got you a £5. And people say, it's not enough. She comes back with a negotiating team. £10, £15, £20. Every time the mass meeting rejects it. And at the end, what did she say in desperation? What the hell do you want? And they shout out socialism. And she says, the management will never agree to that. Because that's the nature of the beast that we're involved with. It's limitations. And also, just tell me the story, and please forgive me just for going over 30 seconds. We were involved in an anti-privatisation fight in Edinburgh. They wanted to take 4,200 workers and put them into enterprise. Right? I'll tell you what then happened. We went to the Unite and the Unison shop stewards, our members as well, and they felt there wasn't a lot of confidence about it. We mobilised inside the community. We formed and helped to form 3 anti-cuts groups across Edinburgh. They lobbied, campaigned and fought, and some people in there said, Willie, they'll never fight. They're only interested in their pensions and their bloody wages, right? And I'll tell you what happened. We were then able to lever onto those workers an argument that if you fight, we'll fight. Together we can do something about saving our communities, because the consequences of privatisation was that we were going to be cut. So what happens? I'll tell you what, enterprise was thrown the door, and we've still got 4,200 employees in the state, inside the private sector. There's a lot more to shout and argue about.
Brian, followed by the woman at the back with the light hair.
Sorry, I wasn't planning on speaking today. I mean, I have to thank John, because it's very rarely that I actually listen to something and I agree with all of it. I mean, you know, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting up all night doing strike ballots and all of those things, and I mean, the good thing is that it actually gets easier when you do it 3 weeks later, thanks to cut and paste. You just add the new members on and you get it on. Sorry to say that most of them are Unison members, and that was the thing. That's why Unison couldn't come out and strike, and Unison and Unite are the same that way. Basically, that you are left to do it yourself. And then the thing is that if you're stuck, just go ahead and do it yourself. That is, I mean, maybe sometimes Unite's the do-it-yourself union in that way, but at least we can do it. I actually wanted to wait until Ian Bradley spoke first, because that was the inspiration for me for doing this, was the Frank Morris, the Ian Bradley, do that thing, go down, union doesn't give you the membership form, union doesn't give you the flags, but just do it yourself. The union will follow. It's actually true what they say. You can't actually wait there for the union to come in. You've got to form the union, bring the union in yourself. And as I said, like, you know, if you lead, others will follow. And I could have said, like, a year ago, we're never going to go on strike. No one will vote for it. Yeah, but what they wanted was leadership. People get upset about their pay cut. You would be surprised, the sort of people that you would have thought, Christian, Tories, whatever. There's enough. We got to a stage now where, you know, everyone will follow you. You know, it is a race to the bottom. People need to say no. And actually, the great thing about saying no, you've got nothing to lose. They're not offering anything. You will just get more, no matter what happens.
Go on then.
Sorry, our next strike date's 24th, 25th, 26th. It's going to be twice as big as the last time. We've doubled our membership. Join us at next to the Roundhouse.
On the other side, the man in the white shirt and the glasses at the front here.
Yeah, I think there's, going back to the person from Unite who spoke earlier, I think in this room, you know, a lot of people would be getting around the argument, you can't trust the bureaucracy. They've marched us halfway up the hill so many times, and then when they get something, just a chance to get their feet under the table, they sell us out with a crap deal. Now, there's 2 ways you can respond to that. We've had that experience quite a lot, obviously over pensions, over pay, all the rest of it.
what's the solution to this? Is the solution to say, all right, let's just go and build a rank and file movement? That is so abstract. We have to think realistically about how that rank and file movement comes into being. And that is the question of being with the bureaucracy when they are doing something that gives us an angle that we can get in on build, and against them when they're not. Now, that's not just sloganising, that's a reality. After the pension strike, I'm in one of the teaching unions in the UCU, they literally dragged us to the top of the hill. That strike came off the back of a series of local actions that empowered us at conferences to argue for widening, broadening, linking the action and generalising. The strike took place. Then after the sellout that was pushed through, the heads of agreement thing that most of you in the room will know about, after that happened, you could just say, well, that just shows you they're a bunch of bastards. Let's just go and build a rank and file movement. That is abstaining. That's absolute abstention. What you have to do is go back and start to look at what you got out of that, what that showed you, and how you can rebuild from that position. Now, in my branch, Croydon, a little branch, not one of the bigger branches inside UCU, we've managed since then to win a series of battles saying, if we take some form of action, if we take the argument for what we're fighting over strikes and so on, and we look to see what the teachers locally are doing, we look to take that to our regional and national conferences and argue those things forward, then we will actually be the nuts and bolts of building that forward. It's interesting, this last couple of weeks in UCU, we got to conference, those of us who adopted that strategy, with 9 ballots in the bag for industrial action. Without that, we would probably not have won a call for national action. Okay? It's not an either-or position. You have to build on the ground to change the situation at the top. So for us, it's not a question of separation between the rank and file and bureaucracy. It's a question of the tactics of how we move the class forward, and sometimes we try and use some leverage on it, but that will come from below. But it doesn't mean we abstain on positions of taking up national action, making those calls, and standing people in elections, because those elections are around the issues, around the fight back, and so on.
So when John said, Trotsky said, never with the employers, sometimes with the union leaders, always with the workers. I mean, for the trade union bureaucracy, it's sometimes with the employers, but also sometimes with the workers. And actually, and if it wasn't that case, there would never be any strikes, or they'd never call in anyway. But actually, then why do they call the strikes? And it's sometimes because of the pressure of the employers, and sometimes the most unexpected versions. I mean, 1984, Len Murray, leader of TUC, trade unions abandoned GCHQ, he's in the half calls the general strike the next day. You know, sometimes it's under the pressure of the employers, but it's also under the pressure from the rank and file, from us. I mean, if we look at the strikes that have taken place, it isn't just the case that the trade union leaders sat round in a room and said, we're going to have a strike tomorrow afternoon. They're under pressure. I remember this year, I'm in the NUT right now, and when Gove announced basically the scrapping of national pay bargaining, the union called shop stewards, reps meetings around the country. Those reps meetings were packed out. I went to one in London. Christine Blower, the General Secretary of the unions there, every single person got up, said, why aren't you calling for strike action? They produced this PowerPoint presentation about the attack, and someone said that shouldn't be entitled the attack, it should be entitled why we're going on strike. Actually, the fact of the matter is, if it wasn't for that pressure, actually we wouldn't be getting the strikes we're talking about now. So when you're talking about building rank and file organisation, or the roots of it, you build it partly through actually putting pressure on the bureaucracy to call action. And then when you get the action, it opens up the space to build it further. The reality is, when we had the first of the national strikes over pensions, I got 24 people from my workplace to come on the national demonstration. The reality, if there wasn't a strike, actually, and when there was another demonstration, there wasn't a strike, I got 4 people. The reality, it creates that possibility. The picket lines create the possibility. And actually, at the same time, what we have to do is avoid the danger of saying, actually, it's okay now, all power to the General Council, so it was 1926, but, or all power to the trade union leaders now. We say, yes, great, they're calling the action, but at the same time, we actually have to continue to keep the pressure and build the links for when they don't call the action. You know, and actually, and we can do that. I mean, in my workplace, when it became clear at first they were going for regional action, so many people were saying, oh, pissed off. There were some people talking about leaving the union. You know, I imagine there might have been some pieces, people talking about resigning their positions. But actually, what did we argue? No. Actually, what we need to do is how do we continue to put the pressure on them? We also did start to have the discussion about actually, well, if it came came to the crunch and they weren't doing it, would people be willing to walk out unofficially? You know, we raised that argument, you know, and actually people said, yeah, maybe, but if there were other schools, you know, we start to build those links. Now, it will come at stages, well, we'll take that action unofficially, but I don't know when it's going to be, whether it'll be next week, next year, who knows? The point is actually we do the two things at the same time. We argue for the maximum action. We argue in terms of putting pressure on the bureaucracy. We take part in that action, at the same time use it to try and develop the roots of independent working class organisation which can carry the struggle forward instead of just sustaining.
Thank you. I'll take the man with the check shirt now, followed by the man with the beige jacket halfway down.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things really. The first thing is to go back to the strikes in 2011 because they didn't parachute from above, simply. I want to repeat what Paul was saying really, because there was an interpenetration of the relationship with the officials, right stuff, with the people of the union, the branches and the regions on the ground, and with the rank and file. If we don't understand that, right stuff, we don't understand the processes that made the strike happen, we also don't understand the process of the retreat. But I also want to talk about Jonh McLoughlin, because if you talk about with and against, this must be the summary of the situation. Where am I between Jonh McLoughlin and Ed Miliband? I'll tell you where I am. I'm with bloody Jonh McLoughlin. I'm for the right to fight for working class representation of MPs and the rest of it. I am on Len's side in that situation. When he stands up at the People's Assembly and argues for mass civil disobedience, when he argues for a general strike but leaves out the date, when he argues for action, I am with Len in that situation. Right, stuff about it, and that's extremely important. We do see a difference between the left and right officials. Of course there's a difference between having Mark Sawotka or Jonh McLoughlin and others, but there's a but, isn't there? There's a but in the situation, which is we know and stuff. That despite the fact that Unite have done some great things around the issue of the blacklist over the last few months and other things, we know that sometimes there is a big gap between the rhetoric and what is delivered, and we know that in 2011 and 2012. We know even over key issues like the Sparks dispute and other things that people have raised, that it took the rank and file to move before they put pressure on the officials, and there was then an interpenetration between the relationship of how the rank and file moves and how the officials respond, the interpenetration of the official and unofficial calls. And just the last thing about it really is the vote for Jerry Hicks, because what does it sum up? Right, so Jonh McLoughlin is probably, apart from Mark Sawotka, the most articulate individual of expressing opposition to austerity inside the trade union movement. This is somebody who ran their campaign under the basis of a call for a general strike, right, stuff, a call for mass action, a call for civil disobedience, a call, really the kind of things, why did 80,000 people vote to the left of that? Why? Right, stuff, you could say this was in some way a right-wing vote, I don't know, there's lots of explanations. This is clearly tens of thousands of workers who can see that the gap is there. And therefore, and stuff, as a strategy, we have to have a strategy that works with the officials when they rightly represent us, as they said, but trying to develop a level of independence where we can, without being grandiose about it. We're not talking at this stage about a rank and file movement across Britain, but every small step, right, so is a step towards it. When people, this last thing about it is the teachers' strikes, I think, are a good example. If you look at the build-up to the teachers' strikes, the bureaucracy call the action, limited action, they call mass rallies, good, 1,000 teachers in Birmingham, pumping up the situation, when a strike is called, 5,000 on the streets in Manchester, and it starts to shift the bloody officials. It's not a shock to me that that's straight after the success of that action, they named the strikes for the autumn and the possibility of national action in the year after. So we have to get this right. We are with the officials when they rightly represent us. We do take a step between left and right, but all the time without but grandiose schemes around it, we are trying to build up the confidence and self-activity of the rank and file.
Followed by the man in the maroon shirt at the back.
Yeah, I want to carry on with something Michael started with and something the speaker spoke about really, and my initial name UCU, and how we got the strikes at the beginning of you. Because when you ask the simple question, why the education unions? Why UCU? The UCU is what, 120,000 members, the 12th largest union in the country, not particularly huge. Why? First, there was a political reason. It's attack on education. What the attack on education symbolises the class attacks on our young people. Hence the strikes, hence the demonstrations, the protests, the students, the EMA and so on. So firstly, to understand why education, why the teachers' union, isn't simply because they're pissed off about their pay conditions and so on. It's the attack on education which is politicised and is a driver to the whole thing. Number one. Number two, it is not simply, and I want to say this because it's not simply just because we have managed to sort of capture the top of the union that we somehow did so, and then really unsuspectingly we called a strike and everybody came out. I wish it'd be so easy, because I mean there is this, I think, ridiculous argument. I think it's completely right. The expression when I hear some people speak about the old adage, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, I do get this sometimes, because when you look, the idea that the pension strikes was somehow a bureaucratic strike from above misunderstands what took place around those strikes that build up to them. You know, I've been working in further education for 12 years. In those 12 years, I've been on strike 14 times. A combination of official, unofficial, regional, national. To be honest with you, it isn't because I'm complete nutcase inside my workplace. It isn't the case. Although some people probably think that is the case, it isn't. To be honest with you, if you talk to most people in further education, they'll experience the same kind of thing. We've probably taken as much strike action as many have done so. Why? Well, partly because we lost national bargaining back in 1993, and therefore we had to eke it out at a local level, fighting over pay, conditions. You know, I've been on strike over the war, I've been on strike over pensions, I've been on strike over bloody contracts, you know, you name it, observation policies, and that's without the local lunchtime protests standing outside shaking their fist just to make a point and so on and so forth, right? Now, again, I might be an exaggerated version of what happened, but it's not unusual to find that take place. You heard Margot speak. Margot's branch was one of the weakest branches. They built it up precisely through the method which I've just actually spoken about. So that's the second part to understanding why UCU. Yes, the political question of education, but also fundamentally because of those attacks, you had, over at a local level, you had to fight to defend your conditions and so on, and built up a level of strength at the bottom. And therefore, then we can talk about, on the context of that, a bit of luck with the merged union and so on. 5 years ago, we managed to win a whole number of seats, and therefore use that position to actually take action. So the idea that something is a bureaucratic strike doesn't understand what takes place, and this is not just inside UCU, by the way. This is taking place across the union. I mean, hopefully somebody, you know, more intelligent than I will do a study on this, perhaps, looking at what is taking place inside the rank and file, the kinds of disputes. I know it's going on in teaching as they break up national bargaining in local government and other places, in health and so on. That is actually what is taking place, and that lays the basis for the potential for rank and file organisation and confidence. We're not there yet, hence we still need a relationship to the bureaucracy in the rank and file, and working with the officials to be able to call the kind of action that is necessary. That is what's taking place. That's what has led us to get the action. Misunderstanding that leaves us to, in this last point, leaves us to either abstaining or looking for ultra stunts. That's the conclusion.
Yeah.
I was hoping John could sort of come back on this. I know John mentioned 72 at Pentonville. My father was a shop steward. He's in this picture somewhere. I think just behind the bit where it says "Arise, you workers." I think he was sitting down. So is he shy? Yeah, no, he certainly isn't shy. But the reason I say I was born in 75, and 3 years after Pentonville. I'm just wondering. This is more just a thought, I suppose. I know this, the old kind of thing about Thatcher bought off the working class and everything, and you're saying wages went up, right? Which I don't find unsurprising. I'll tell you the reason why. In 73, 2 years before I was born, my parents and about 10 other dock workers all bought property in Stratford that was built by the council. It was council that then sold property to workers. Why? Because actually they'd been on strike, they felt confident, they felt like they could win. And even within the kind of confines of capitalism, they felt like as if they felt successful. It didn't buy them off, because they was out in support of the Brunswick workers years later. They was out in support of my workers. 2 years later, they bring down the government. See, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. I actually think the rank and file, looking back at the 70s, I suppose, if you like, and perhaps you can come back on this, John, or tell me some statistics or whatever else it is, actually started to feel more confident, felt more powerful, and I'm not surprised that actually in the 80s wages went up and all the rest of it. I know by 89 it was a completely different picture, but also what occurred sort of like towards the end of the late 70s, I suppose, certainly in education, is this idea of union facility time. And in our borough, in Waltham Forest, in teaching, they've decided to do away with the union facilities time. The local authority have said, well, we're not sure, we might have to pay for it. The head teachers have all kind of got themselves together and they said, well, we're not going to pay into this union facilities time. And it's a complete and utter mess. And the reason why I'm saying it is because potentially it looks an absolute disaster. It looks like, well, teachers have got no trade union recognition, they've got no support, everything like that. But actually I think it opens up a possibility that what you're going to end up having to do is deal with the shop steward. You're going to have to go back to dealing with the trade union representative. A bit like, if you like, with teaching, where years ago we would have assumed it was kind of like a bit of a profession and everything else like that. Along with all the other attacks, it now opens up the possibility that on, as horrible as it is, that you're actually going to have to deal with things at shop floor level. And I think that there is a potential there. I think you can look at it in a dreadful way, but I actually think it opens up potential for getting back to, if you like, potentially getting back to rank and file activity. I'm not saying it's completely the case, because there's going to be problems with it, but there is that potential there. I'm just hoping, John, you'll be able to come back on it.
So I'm going to ask John to come back for 5 minutes to sum up.
You have to ask my academic friend Ralph here for all the details. I mean, my attitude about Thatcher is simply this. I do think the miners fought so long and so hard that it derailed them to something. I remember personally, 1984, I was on strike every month of 1984. We had fallout strikes in my branch in 1984. We had a thing, I was in the civil service, where if one office had a strike, we'd all meet up at night time. You'd bring the strikers, you'd bring people from other officers and said, tomorrow you've got to go and get your office out. And we'd bring out 35 officers at a time. That was easier because of the anti-union laws. But that was partly as well because it was what was going on with the miners. And I think it delayed the Tories. It delayed the Tories to such a degree. So I think you can't separate that struggle. The big point I want to make is this, the one I started with. I don't believe it is possible for the ruling class to get through the scale of attacks that are now proposed over the next few years without there being mass resistance. And I think you see that within the trade union bureaucracy. Because if you'd have asked most people in this room 6 months ago, you would have said Len McCluskey, Dave Prentice and all the trade unionship have got a strategy. And the strategy is 2015. We'll get Labour in, we'll talk about an alternative Labour. That strategy now looks like nowhere, doesn't it? And I'll tell you why. It's partly from the right, Miliband is attacking on the trade union. And we should be very clear on the link, by the way. We are absolutely for the right of trade unions to take a full part in the Labour Party. We pay the dues into the Labour Party. We should have the right to shape Labour policy. It's absolutely right, trade unions should have the right to help select candidates. Why should it only be big business and those influential people who have it? But you go, I mean, if you go around the union conference after union conference, the argument about waiting for Labour just has no echo with people at all. Which is why at the People's Assembly, it's very interesting. You know, you look at it, it looked like a very radical platform, but the audience was to the left of the platform. The audience weren't interested in, and the strongest feeling was when people talked about the disgrace of Labour, not reversing Tory cuts, not talking about any difference, continuing pay restraint, the anger is palpable. And I think that reflects real anger inside the class. So this with again, so for example, I'll give you this demonstration on the 29th of September. Until 2 days before the Unison conference, Unison, as the biggest health union, was opposed to having a demonstration about the NHS. Absolutely opposed. It had been through our health conference. A week before, our national executive said we're absolutely opposed to it. My branch in Camden, we had a resolution in calling for the demonstration, and blow Thursday, 2 days before the conference, I got called into the union headquarters. I didn't get to see Dave Prentice, I'm not that important. I got to see Liz Snape. For insiders, that's probably more important. that's Mrs. Dave Prentice, the one who really calls the shots in our union. And she said to me, John, we don't want to have a row about the NHS, do we? I said, no, of course not. She said on the Wednesday o'clock, when Dave gets up to speak, before the main motion, he's going to announce we're calling a demonstration at the Tory party conference in defence of the NHS. Do you still want to put your... I said, no. If Dave's doing it, I'm happy. If Dave's calling for a demonstration outside the Tory party conference, I'm with Dave. Do I trust Dave? Another question. And so I think we need to be optimistic about the possibilities. I wanted Brian to come up to speak, because it's interesting, because there must be people like Brian all over the country. And probably lots of places over the country where nothing does happen. But the Brian made a difference. Having someone who said we're going to fight, and that's really one of the messages from the Socialist Workers' Party. We need to be the Bryans. We need to be people in every workplace who say you can fight. We are good at it. We are going to get people to be. Right,
Brian.
Pat, what are you doing next? Who's Spartacus? Who's Brian? This is the new slogan of Oxford. Who's Brian? So Brian, we need to go for this conference. We need to build towards a Tory party conference. I just want to say that quite. Of course it's true at the moment, there are very few people who can lead absolutely independent action, but still the principle applies. The principle of trying to develop independence from bureaucracy. The principle of pushing it as far as you can and building those networks. Which is what I want to say, as well as getting to Manchester on the 29th of September, get to the United Resistance Conference. Because we need to be part of, in every union, fighting for change, fighting for real resistance, but building up the networks of people who stand for that principle of independence and look at every opportunity for doing it. And I will agree with Sean very strongly, because you look back to 30th November 2011 and you can say it was controlled, but I'll tell you what it's like in East London. We decided we'd have satellite pickets in various areas and that we would try and bring the strikers together. In the end, people all ended up going to the Royal London Hospital, which, if you know our union, is the most right-wing site. Hundreds of people went there. And then they decided, we've got to go, and so we're going to get the tube, what we're going to do, we'll march. And do you know where they marched? To St Paul's Cathedral, to meet the occupied people and take them on to the demonstration. And across Britain, there were more than 100,000 demonstrations, rallies took place, and at every single one of them, there were speakers from the left and the Socialist Workers' Party trying to win an argument about how we take the struggle. Now, we weren't strong enough to take it forward, but that's part of building a movement. And that's what we're about. Building a movement that can take the struggle forward now, building a movement that can change the world. That's what we've got to fight for.